A pair of mountain bikers rode into the dense forests near Lake Tahoe on a crisp autumn morning, smiling in their final photo, unaware it would become a symbol of one of the region's most baffling disappearances. For 5 years, their fate was locked in silence, buried somewhere within the towering ridgelines and icy ravines of the Sierra Nevada. Then, a drone operator mapping erosion patterns captured something at the base of a 160-foot cliff that shattered the stillness and reopened a case that had long since gone cold. The sun had just begun to cut through the pine canopy that blanketed the northern trailheads around Lake Tahoe, illuminating shafts of gold across the dew-dampened forest floor. It was October 9th, 2018, a Tuesday. The air had the soft bite of early fall, and a low mist clung to the edges of the winding fire road that veered off into the Basin Wilderness Preserve. It was the kind of morning made for movement, cool, silent, alive. Kyle Merritt and Logan Reese were both experienced riders, weekend warriors, who had turned their shared hobby into a ritual of escape from their otherwise tech-saturated lives in Sacramento. The plan was simple: a single-day loop through a moderately difficult 22-mile circuit known for its switchbacks and panoramic views. With a quick stop at their favorite overlook, Eagles Watch. They'd biked it twice before. Their departure was as unremarkable as it was ordinary. A gray SUV parked just beyond the gate at 6:42 a.m., as confirmed by the trailhead's motion-activated wildlife cam. Two men, geared in helmets, hydration packs, and brightly colored windbreakers, unloaded carbon frame bikes and checked their tires. A final wave to the camera, Logan's trademark two-finger peace sign, and then they pedaled out of frame. They were never seen alive again. When Kyle's girlfriend Jenna failed to hear from him by 8 p.m. that evening, concern turned quickly to dread. Kyle's texts were predictable quick check-ins, shared photos, and GPS pings. That day, there had been just one: a sweeping landscape shot, sent at 10:13 a.m., showing the brilliant blue shimmer of Lake Tahoe far below the ridge. Logan's silhouette was faint in the foreground, back turned, helmet slightly askew. The caption read simply, "Top of the world." It would become the most analyzed image of the investigation. By 10:45 p.m., a missing persons report had been filed. By sunrise the next morning, search efforts had already begun. The initial operation was small: a ranger and 2 volunteers fanning out from the main trailhead. But within 48 hours, it had exploded into one of the largest missing person searches in the park's history. Dozens of volunteers combed the trails, aided by dogs, infrared drones, and a National Guard helicopter that circled over the dense, vertigo-inducing terrain. What made it so perplexing was the sheer lack of evidence. There were no tire tracks veering off trail, no dropped gear, no crash site, and no sign of animal activity. It was as if the two men had simply dissolved into the mist. The only object found in the first week was Logan's water bottle, a matte black aluminum flask with a faded mountain decal discovered lying upright near the edge of a ravine, the cap still screwed on, the surface free of scratches or debris. It was puzzling in its presentation. Too clean, too deliberate. Investigators marked it as a waypoint, but privately, doubts grew. If the bottle had been placed there, not dropped, what did that imply? By day 9, the official narrative had begun to splinter. One theory suggested the pair had ventured off-trail for an impromptu photo opportunity and suffered a fatal fall into one of the hundreds of unnamed gullies and ravines. Another pointed to the possibility of an animal attack, though that lacked physical evidence. A darker speculation quietly circulated among investigators, but never made the public. Imagined a human encounter gone wrong, an illegal grow site, a backwoods confrontation, a wrong place, wrong time, in a forest that, despite its postcard serenity, held its own secrets. But these were just theories. No bodies, no bikes, no crash, nothing. 6 weeks in, the search was suspended. The Merritt and Reese families were devastated. Kyle's parents, both retired school teachers, held a candlelight vigil at their local community center. Logan's sister, a graphic designer, created a digital campaign that reached over 2 million people in 3 days. Tips flooded in sightings, hunches, possible clues, but none led anywhere meaningful. The case grew cold, except for Jenna. She never stopped looking. Every 3 months, like clockwork, she returned to Tahoe. She hiked the same trails the men had vanished on, dragging behind her a GPS-mapped cart filled with first aid gear, water, and laminated flyers that had long since curled at the edges. Over time, the volunteers faded. Interest waned. The internet moved on, but Jenna didn't. Then came June 3rd, 2023. It was an unusually dry spring, and the Park Service had partnered with a local environmental group to map erosion damage along the less-traveled cliff zones. A hobbyist drone pilot named Mason Leary was assisting flying high-resolution mapping runs near a precarious zone known as Devil's Hollow, roughly 5 miles from the pair's last known location. He was stitching together topography footage when he noticed something that didn't belong. A glint of sun off metal, where there should have been only rock and shadow. Curious, he adjusted the drone's altitude, circling the base of a narrow granite drop that plummeted 160 feet from a crumbling ledge above. There, at the very base, partially obscured by fallen logs and old rockfall, was the unmistakable curve of a bicycle wheel, and next to it, unmistakably, impossibly the faded blue of a windbreaker sleeve, caught on a jagged piece of shale. He froze. Then he called the ranger station. The case was no longer cold. The ranger who took Mason Leary's call was seasoned and unflinching, the kind of man who had seen enough false leads and bones of deer mistaken for men to respond with measured skepticism. But something in Mason's voice, shaking, insistent, tinged with a stunned reverence, carried weight. He wasn't just reporting an object, he was describing a scene. Ranger Elise Vartan was dispatched to meet him. She was a field lead with over a decade of experience in search and rescue operations. When she arrived at the edge of Devil's Hollow, Mason had already flagged the coordinates and preloaded the drone footage onto a ruggedized tablet. She watched in silence as the feed played, the downward tilt of the camera, the moment of discovery, and the slow, eerie orbit around the cliff's base. When the windbreaker came into focus, Elise blinked. There was no mistaking that color. A pale blue shell with orange piping, a limited edition piece released by a boutique cycling company 5 years prior. It matched the description of Logan Reese's outer layer down to the stitching. The descent to the base of the cliff was not easy. Devil's Hollow had earned its name not from any folklore, but from the brutal topography that made access a nightmare. There were no trails here, no switchbacks, just loose shale, vertical scrambles, and narrow ledges that gave way without warning. Elise radioed for backup before attempting the approach. 2 hours later, she and a secondary responder reached the clearing. What they found was not just a recovery site. It was a moment frozen in geological time, an echo of violence, of velocity, and of sudden stillness. There were 2 bicycles, or what remained of them, twisted frames, bent rims, and spokes snapped like brittle twigs. One bike had embedded itself almost vertically into a bed of soft moss and scree, its front fork shattered. The other lay nearby, folded grotesquely against a boulder, its rear tire still faintly inflated. And then there were the bodies. One was positioned face down, partially covered by pine needles and a collapsed chunk of granite. The other was sprawled a few feet away, arm outstretched as if reaching for something in the final seconds. Time and nature had done their work. Clothing faded, skin long gone. What remained was skeletal, but disturbingly intact. They were found side by side, like punctuation marks at the end of a 5-year sentence. Forensics would later confirm what the scene already suggested. Both individuals died on impact. The fall had been catastrophic. Autopsy results noted multiple compound fractures, blunt force trauma, and massive internal injuries incompatible with survival. And yet, the cliff had not been part of their planned route. It was miles off course. The question was not how they died. That part was tragically clear. The question was, why were they there? When word reached the families, it fell like a thunderclap across 5 years of silence. The confirmation was both a release and a rupture. For Jenna, it was the end of a long, slow descent through hope and grief. But it was also something else, a mystery solved only halfway. She made the drive to Tahoe in silence, alone. She did not bring anyone. She did not speak to reporters. When she arrived at the ranger station, Elise Vartan met her privately and walked her through the artifact. Kyle's watch, cracked but still strapped to bone. Logan's necklace, his sister confirmed it instantly. A weathered pack, with protein bar wrappers still inside, some uneaten. One of the more haunting items was a GoPro, miraculously recovered from beneath a pile of leaf litter and detritus. The camera itself was shattered, but the micro SD card had survived, sealed inside like a time capsule. That card would become the key. The footage began as one would expect. Helmet cam views of winding trails, wind noise, and the rhythmic rattle of bike chains. Kyle and Logan laughing, commenting on the changing leaves, passing a group of mule deer grazing by a creek. Then, somewhere around the 11-mile mark, the footage shifted. They were off trail. The trees thickened, the terrain roughened. One of them, likely Logan, based on the camera angle, commented on a shortcut that could reconnect them with the overlook from the west side. The maps they carried were digital, synced to a trail app with mixed coverage. It's likely they lost signal. More than likely, they misread the ridgelines. The footage grew rougher and shakier. Then it cut to a still shot, a break. The camera picked up again 2 hours later. The sky had changed, the sun was lower, the laughter was gone. Logan's voice, faint but audible, muttered something unintelligible. There were signs of tension, frustration. At one point, Kyle's voice came through clear. This doesn't feel right. They were lost. The final segment was only 38 seconds long. It showed the edge of the cliff, the top of Devil's Hollow, from the perspective of someone standing far too close. Wind buffeted the mic. Logan said something about the lake view. A moment later, the camera jolted violently, first one way, then the other, and then cut to black. No scream, no thud, just silence. The footage confirmed what had long been suspected but never proven. The two riders had strayed into an unmarked zone of unstable cliff edges, likely trying to reconnect to the trail via terrain that looked passable from the top, but concealed a sheer drop just beyond the tree line. They had not been chased. They had not been attacked. They had made a decision, a miscalculation. But there was still one piece that didn't make sense. The water bottle. It had been found over 4 miles away upright, pristine, and far from the crash site. The new mystery had just begun. The discovery of the bodies had given resolution to a question that had haunted 2 families for 5 years. But the discovery of the water bottle reopened a door they hadn't even realized was ajar. It was recovered by a father and son backpacking through a remote section of Ridgeline Trail, a full 4 miles west of Devil's Hollow. The son had kicked it by accident, assuming it was trash, but his father had noticed something odd. The bottle was clean, too clean. No signs of weathering, no dirt caked along the grooves, no algae crusted at the rim. It looked, in a word, fresh. They had no way of knowing what it was, only that it was out of place. When they brought it back to a ranger outpost, a young volunteer matched it against the items found with the 2 missing cyclists. The model, the stickers, even the worn grip marks from the gloves Kyle used. It was an exact match. And the problem was this: it didn't belong there. The terrain between Devil's Hollow and the water bottle's discovery point was nearly impassable. There were no direct ridgeline paths, no viable shortcut. If one of the cyclists had somehow survived the fall and crawled for miles in that direction, there would have been signs of blood, broken vegetation, abandoned gear. But the site at Devil's Hollow was conclusive. Both had died on impact. So, how did the bottle get there? It became a haunting question, one that the Rangers initially kept quiet. It was too soon. The families were still processing the first answers. This new wrinkle was too delicate, too strange. Ranger Elise Vartan took the lead, walking the terrain personally. She studied maps and consulted with geologists and environmental scientists. She even brought in a hydrologist from the state university who suggested, with hesitation, that perhaps runoff from snowmelt had carried the bottle across that distance. But when Elise and her team hiked the projected route of such runoff, they found no erosion paths, no water channels capable of transporting a full-sized bottle over 4 ridges and through a dense pine barrier. Which left one other explanation. Someone placed it there. But who? And why? The GoPro footage suggested no third party. The crash site showed no signs of foul play. The case had never been classified as suspicious until now. Elise submitted an official request to reopen the investigation under a new classification, unresolved incident with anomalous findings. The designation was rare and bureaucratic, but it allowed her access to state forensic labs and tracking teams, typically used for law enforcement operations. If someone had been there after the fall, before the bodies were found, they needed to know. 2 weeks after the new classification was filed, a hiker came forward. He didn't want publicity. His name wasn't shared, but he told a story that Elise couldn't ignore. He'd been hiking alone in the fall of 2019, 1 year after the cyclists disappeared on a rarely used trail that flanked the western rim of Devil's Hollow. He'd stopped to take a photograph of the lake when he saw movement below. A figure, small against the vast drop, was descending one of the narrow cliff trails. Not rock climbing, not hiking. Just moving, slowly, cautiously, like someone who knew exactly where they were going. The figure wore a faded orange jacket. The hiker assumed it was a ranger or a researcher. But when he mentioned it to a ranger at the time, they dismissed it. There had been no sanctioned activity in that area, they'd said. Probably just a hiker off-trail. But the man was certain of what he'd seen. And now, with news of the body spreading, he'd come forward, certain the movement had not been a coincidence. Elise noted the time of year. October, dry weather, clear visibility. The day the man described was clear enough to have seen a person from that distance, and orange. Logan's jacket had been orange, but Logan's body had been found wearing it. So who had he seen? Elise ordered a drone survey of the narrow ridge trails around Devil's Hollow. The drones flew pre-mapped circuits for days, scanning every crag, every outcropping. It was on the 4th day that one of the operators noticed something odd. A small circle of stones, deliberately arranged, near the top of a southern-facing slope. It was partially hidden by a large pine tree, but distinct enough to register as unnatural. When a ranger team reached the site, they found more than a stone circle. There were remnants of a fire, charred wood, ash, and even a melted aluminum can partially fused to a rock. Nearby, they found a crushed plastic wrapper from a protein bar, the same brand found in the recovered backpack at the crash site. But these were newer, fresher. Someone had been there in the last 6 months. For the first time, Elise Vartan considered a possibility she had refused to entertain for 5 years. What if the crash site had not been the end? What if someone else had found them first? The idea seemed impossible. But the clues were piling up like sediment, layer by layer. Evidence that didn't align. The clean water bottle, the unexplained fire ring, the hiker's sighting. And a final detail, one Elise had kept to herself. The GoPro footage from the crash? It had a final metadata timestamp, automatically generated by the camera's system. And the time didn't match the phone logs. According to the phone data retrieved from the cloud, Kyle's last known signal pinged at 3:43 p.m. But the final GoPro clip where the fall occurred was stamped 6:12 p.m. Over 2 hours later, someone had turned the camera off, and someone had turned it back on. The digital discrepancy became Elise Vartan's obsession. She brought in 2 forensic tech analysts, not from the Park Service, but from a private contractor the Bureau had used in cases where metadata manipulation or digital forensics crossed into gray territory. What they found turned Elise's gut into a hard, cold knot. The GoPro's firmware was intact, meaning it hadn't been tampered with. The camera had been turned off at 3:44 p.m., roughly 1 minute after the last image was captured, the moment when the boys plunged into the ravine. But it had not remained off. At 6:12 p.m., it powered back on, not automatically, not by glitch, manually. It recorded for 12 seconds, a static shot, mostly unfocused, aimed toward the cliff wall. Then it clicked off again. That brief clip had been previously overlooked by investigators in the overwhelming presence of the fall footage. And because it showed no faces, no recognizable figures, just blurred pine needles and a streak of lens flare. But with this new attention, the analysts enhanced it, applying filters to correct light distortion and increase depth contrast. On the far left of the frame, barely visible, was the outline of what appeared to be a leg, bent at the knee. The color of the pants was brown, but they were not hiking gear. Heavier fabric, possibly canvas. A frame-by-frame comparison was made against the clothing recovered from both missing cyclists. It didn't match either of them. Whoever had restarted the camera had been there, within feet of the bodies or the crash site, at 6:12 p.m., long after any hope of survival. And they'd turned the camera off again after a few seconds. The question was no longer if someone had found them. It was why they hadn't told anyone, and how deeply they'd interfered. Elise decided to revisit all leads from the initial investigation. Not the digital ones, the human ones. In the first few weeks following the cyclist's disappearance, over 24 witnesses had called in tips, sightings, and overheard conversations. Most were ruled out, but Elise focused on one in particular. A report from a seasonal worker at a general store 20 miles north of the park boundary. He had claimed 2 days after the disappearance that a man had come in alone, around dusk, looking shaken and scraped up. The man had asked to use the restroom and purchased only 3 items: bandages, a disposable camera, and a bottle of rubbing alcohol. He paid in cash and left quickly, avoiding eye contact. At the time, rangers had considered the sighting irrelevant. No description of a bike, no indication the man had come from the mountains. But Elise now saw it differently. The general store still existed, run by the same family. She drove there herself, hoping the employee still worked. He didn't. He'd moved away. But the owner remembered the incident, vaguely. "My son swore the guy looked like he'd fallen down a rock slide," she said. "Dirty as hell. But he didn't want any help. Just in and out." When Elise asked if the store had any security cameras back then, the woman laughed. "This isn't a bank," she said. "But we did have one of those trail cams. My husband put it up after someone kept stealing firewood. The old SD cards were still in a drawer under the counter. Dozens of them, unlabeled, mostly corrupted from heat or neglect. Elise offered to catalog and digitize them herself. She took the cards back to her office and spent the next 6 hours clicking through grainy, time-stamped images. Most showed nothing but logs, the occasional raccoon, or customers picking up propane. Then, in the folder labeled June 2018, 3, she found it. A single frame, captured at 7:03 p.m., dated 2 days after the crash. A man in his mid-30s, emerging from the tree line behind the store. Dirty face, scuffed jacket, brown canvas pants. No visible injuries, but something about his posture, shoulders hunched, head down, spoke of exhaustion or guilt. He wasn't carrying anything. No backpack, no gear, but his boots were caked in a reddish-brown smear. The angle was poor. No clear shot of his face. But Elise enhanced the image as much as she could. She saw a patch on the sleeve, a logo, an emblem of a pine tree inside a circle. She froze. That patch belonged to a trail conservation group based in the region, a volunteer crew responsible for maintaining backcountry routes. Elise contacted their local chapter. Within days, she had a full roster of every registered volunteer in summer 2018. Most were college students, retirees, or part-time naturalists. And then there was one name that stood out. Not because it was familiar, but because it wasn't. The man had only volunteered for 1 month in June of that year. No other record. No returned emails. A background check listed a P.O. box and a phone number that was now disconnected. His emergency contact had been left blank, and the profile photo submitted with his volunteer form was missing. A clerical oversight, they'd said. Elise submitted a request to the state's DMV for any identification linked to the name and address. The return came back the next afternoon. The man's real name wasn't the one on the volunteer form. It was an alias. His real name was linked to a minor arrest 5 years prior to illegal trapping in a national forest. He had served a short sentence and disappeared into the system. His last known residence was a trailer on the outskirts of Carson City. Elise didn't call local police. Not yet. She needed to see it herself. If there was a chance this man had been at the scene, if he had touched the GoPro, moved the water bottle, or built the fire ring, he might still have something. Evidence, photos, even a journal. Something that would finally explain why this mystery had twisted into something darker than a simple accident. When she reached the trailer, it was abandoned, but not empty. The trailer sat crookedly at the edge of a dry, weed-choked lot on the far side of Carson City. It leaned slightly to one side, as if the desert wind had tried to peel it away from the earth, but failed. The windows were covered in foil. A rusting antenna stood like a broken mast on its roof, and 2 sun-bleached tires lay discarded beside a cracked concrete step that led nowhere in particular. Elise parked far enough back that dust wouldn't kick up behind her tires, not wanting to announce her arrival with too much presence. The front door wasn't locked. Inside, it smelled of old plywood, evaporated sweat, and the stale, mechanical tang of oxidized batteries. Someone had lived here, but not recently. There were no signs of daily life. No dishes, no food, no clothes flung over furniture. But there were traces. On a low shelf above what had once been a futon, a cluster of objects had been neatly arranged. A black headlamp with cracked straps, a faded topographic map folded down the middle, and a weathered leather-bound journal. It was the journal that drew Elise's hand. Its cover was soft and worn, its edges frayed. She opened it carefully. The handwriting inside was tight, angular, and deliberate. Not a diary, not stream of consciousness. These were entries with purpose, records, notes, observations. The first pages were simple trail data dates, weather patterns, soil moisture levels, and locations of erosion or fallen limbs. A trail maintainer's log. But halfway through the book, the tone shifted. The first entry, dated June 17, 2018, read simply, "Saw them again. 2 bikes chained to a tree. Same ones from the week before. No one's claimed them. No sign of a camp. Something's wrong." Elise flipped forward. June 19. Storm yesterday. The river surged. Checked Lower Canyon. Found a broken limb and helmet strap. No helmets. No gear. Bikes untouched. No prints. And then, June 21. Made the descent near Devil's Gap. Found a scorched area near the creek. Fire ring? Makes no sense. No shelter? No tarp. Just melted plastic and some charred cloth. Wildlife didn't do this. And finally, June 22. They're down there. That entry took up an entire page. Just those 4 words. The following page was blank. The next contained a hand-drawn diagram depicting the slope near the creek, the cliff, and 2 black X's marked at the base. There were more entries after that. Elise read through them, a slow chill climbing her spine. The writer hadn't called for help. He hadn't tried. He'd documented what he'd found, not like someone stumbling upon a tragedy, but like someone studying it, coldly, systematically. He'd written about moving one of the bodies, just slightly, to check for signs of life, he'd written. But Elise could feel the lie in that sentence. Then came the most disturbing entry of all. June 24. Retrieved the GoPro, still functioning. Memory card intact. Can't stop watching it. How fast it happens. How quiet the end is. Can't stop thinking about the one who reached for the other. Elise closed the journal. The images of the crash, the burned spot by the creek, and the cold trail, suddenly, all of it was reframed. This wasn't just the aftermath of an accident. Someone had found the boys days after they vanished. Someone had stayed long enough to build a fire, move objects, and take their belongings, including the very evidence that could have brought closure. And instead of reporting what he saw, he had watched it over and over, like it was a film that haunted him or fascinated him. Maybe both. There were no signs the man still lived in the trailer. But under the futon, Elise found a canvas duffel bag. Inside it were 4 disposable cameras, still in their cardboard boxes. One had a faint mark across the top, a small X in black marker. She took them. Back at the forensics lab, she handed off the cameras with quiet urgency. The film was delicate old and exposed to heat, but 2 rolls produced images, and from the first frame, Elise knew this case had stepped into territory she hadn't anticipated. The photos weren't gruesome. They were worse. They were clinical, shot from above, at angles that emphasized terrain, not faces. Shadows played over the bodies. One frame showed the GoPro still attached to the handlebar. Another showed the fire pit, embers still faintly glowing. The photos were date-stamped by the processor. June 24, 2018. Elise felt herself spiraling inward. For 5 years, everyone had believed the mountain had kept its secret. That the vastness, the cruelty of terrain, had stolen 2 lives and buried them beyond reach. But the truth was far worse. Someone had found the boys while they were still missing, and, instead of alerting rescue teams, had retreated into silence, observing, collecting, preserving the moment, not to help, but perhaps to own it. The man in the photographs remained at large. No name matched DMV records. No fingerprint data came up. But Elise had one more play. She filed for a court order to exhume the metadata records from a now-defunct volunteer communication system used by the trail crew in 2018. It had been decommissioned and archived to tape backup, long believed irretrievable. But a server administrator, curious and sympathetic, dug into the backups. On an encrypted drive, he found a list of volunteer login activity metadata without messages. There was one anomaly. On June 25, 2018, after the presumed date of the GoPro footage, the alias account had logged in one last time and sent a single private message to a now-deleted user. The subject line read, "They were never alone," and the message body contained only coordinates. When plotted, the coordinates landed a mile upriver from the crash site, just outside the original search perimeter. A ledge, a blind spot on most maps, known locally only by a nickname, Shepherd's Fall. Elise didn't know what she would find there, but she knew she had to go. The approach to Shepherd's Fall was more a suggestion of a path than a trail. Elise followed the dry tributary upstream, weaving through twisted manzanita and sharp granite outcrops that jutted from the earth like ancient bones. The name didn't appear on any official map. It was a ghost place. A local reference passed between climbers and rescue teams, often with a touch of superstition. "Don't camp under the fall," they'd say. "The wind talks at night." Elise wasn't thinking about ghost stories. She was thinking about coordinates, about the precision of that message, and about the quiet horror of someone who had watched tragedy unfold and chosen not to intervene. She carried a small satellite transponder in her backpack and a notebook she hadn't opened since the day the boys' remains were identified. On the cover, she had written 2 names, first names only, names she now whispered in rhythm with her breath as she climbed, a reminder of who she was walking for. It took 3 hours to reach the site. The ledge revealed itself slowly, a long horizontal cut in the mountain face that had been hidden from view until she stood almost directly beneath it. There was a way up, a series of natural footholds and angled boulders, but it was no casual hike. It required focus and, at times, the deliberate commitment of hands and knees. Elise took her time. When she finally pulled herself onto the ledge, the silence hit her like a wall. She stood still for a long time, letting her eyes adjust. The air was still and dry. The light filtered through the pine canopy high above. From this height, the entire basin unfolded below miles of forest and stone, scarred by time and water and wind. A place where you could disappear forever if the mountain wanted it. But something in the silence wasn't right. There were footprints, faint, almost erased by time and weather, but still visible in the dust along the rock wall. Too wide to be a deer, too defined to be windblown. Human, they led inward. The ledge widened into a shallow alcove, naturally sheltered and partially enclosed. Elise crouched as she moved inside. The smell was faint but unmistakable: old ash, damp soil, and the ghost scent of something once burned. Near the back of the alcove, shielded by a curve in the rock, she saw it. A metal box, long and low, the kind used for tools or gear. It was rusted around the edges but not locked. She opened it. Inside were items wrapped in waxed canvas. Carefully, reverently, she began to unpack them. A pair of gloves, still stiff with sweat and time. A small journal, different from the one found in the trailer, this one filled with sketches, plants, trails, and topographical elevations. And then, between two folded squares of cloth, something heavier, a hard plastic shell, scratched and scorched at the corners. A GoPro, the same model that had been mounted to one of the boys' bikes. Her hands went cold. Elise didn't hesitate. She sealed the box, slung it over her shoulder, and began the long climb back down the slope, her steps steady, her mind racing. By the time she reached her car, she'd already left a message for the forensic media lab at the station. Priority analysis. Full digital recovery. It took 36 hours. The footage was corrupted in places. Scratches across the lens distorted some of the frames. But the audio was largely intact. And what remained was devastating. The first 5 minutes were ordinary. Two boys laughing, one teasing the other about his braking. Then came the turnoff. The narrow descent down the unmarked slope. The camera caught it all. The speed increasing. The trail narrowing. The blur of branches on either side. Then the sound of the sudden, jarring scrape of metal. The thump of tires losing contact with earth. And then the fall. The frame spun wildly, trees and sky and stone becoming one long smear of chaos, before the camera struck the ground and tumbled to a stop. For a moment, there was only silence. Then came the breathing, shallow, labored. One of the boys was alive. The next 20 minutes were hard to watch. The camera, still running, was tilted at an odd angle, capturing a static patch of dirt, blurred by a smear of blood across the lens. The breathing grew weaker, punctuated by moans. But what came next was worse than silence. Footsteps, off camera, deliberate, approaching. Then a voice. Not a cry, not a shout. A low, steady voice speaking to no one. The words were hard to make out, but the tone was clear, detached, calm. The sound of someone observing, not intervening. And then the breathing stopped. The timestamp on the file confirmed what Elise already feared. The footage had been recorded on the afternoon of June 18, 2000, and 3 full days before the initial search party had even been formed. The boys had not died instantly. At least one had survived the fall. And someone had stood above him and done nothing. Elise sat in the darkened lab, the hum of the computer fan filling the silence left behind by the footage. She felt hollow, but not aimless. The truth wasn't buried anymore. It had simply taken too long to listen to what the mountain had been whispering all along. This was no longer an unsolved case. It was an unresolved one, and the one person who might have the answers still had no name. But he had left breadcrumbs, coordinates, journals, a message sent through a now-deleted account, and maybe, somewhere, a reason. Elise didn't know if she wanted to understand it, but she knew she had to find it. Elise didn't sleep that night. She sat at her kitchen table long past midnight. The journal pages spread out before her, like a crime scene of their own. The handwriting was consistent, precise, slanted, and the kind of script that suggested control. But it was the content that disturbed her more than anything. The entries weren't dated, but they were clearly sequential. Some were observations on weather or terrain, but others hinted at something deeper, something cracked. There was a page that simply read, "I watched them fall. I thought I would feel horror. I felt silence instead." Another said, "Some things don't echo, not in these woods. I tried shouting once. Nothing came back." And one final page, dog-eared and smudged at the edges. They were boys. Just boys. "I didn't want this, but what I wanted stopped mattering a long time ago." Elise closed the journal. She felt the weight of its confession settle into her chest like stone. This wasn't the kind of guilt you could invent. It had a pulse. Whoever had written these pages hadn't just stumbled upon the boys. They had watched them die, and they had done nothing. The GPS metadata embedded in the GoPro's footage revealed a clear point of origin far off any trail, tucked into a region of the basin that Elise had only ever seen from above. It wasn't quite wilderness. It was something more remote than that. It was a place untouched by even the need for paths. By morning, she was back on the road. This time, she brought backup. Not a search party, just a single companion. An old colleague, now retired, who had spent decades mapping the lesser-known regions of Tahoe's outer wilderness zones. He was a geographer by training, but more a cartographer of silence. He knew the way water moved after a heavy snow. He knew how wind carved patterns into loose scree. And most importantly, he knew how to read the land, not for where it had been disturbed, but for where it had remained undisturbed for too long. They drove until the road gave way to gravel, then to dirt. From there, it was a 6-mile hike into the basin toward the heart of the GPS marker. The air was hot, but thin. The kind of heat that didn't sweat so much as desiccate. Pine needles crackled underfoot. Somewhere far off, a hawk screamed once, then fell silent. The coordinates led them to a rise in the land, an old rock outcropping draped with sagebrush and ringed by wind-scoured fir. As they approached, Elise's companion stopped suddenly. He crouched beside the base of a split boulder and pointed. A trail camera, hidden but not expertly. Taped to a branch and camouflaged with burlap and dirt, its lens angled toward a nearby clearing. Someone had been watching. Carefully, they swept the area. A half-buried tarp, a circle of stones from an old fire pit. And then, behind the outcropping, something unexpected. A door. Not a real door, but a hatch, rough plywood, weighted with stones, covering a narrow entrance to what looked like a dugout. A bunker, hand-built, not military grade. More paranoia than preparedness. A survivalist hideaway, dug deep into the slope. Elise called it in. They waited 2 hours before the forensic team arrived at Ranger's protocol. No one wanted to disturb what might be the single most important site in the entire case. When they finally opened the hatch, the air that escaped was dry and musty, like old wood and ash. The structure inside was primitive but deliberate. Walls reinforced with timber, shelves lined with canned food, many rusted through. A small cot, a water filtration rig that hadn't run in years. But what caught their attention wasn't the living space. It was the far wall, a mural. Drawn in charcoal directly onto the wood paneling, it stretched nearly 6 feet in width. A landscape, stylized but recognizable Tahoe's ridgeline in winter, rendered with heavy, anxious strokes. 2 small figures stood near a cliff edge, their forms simplified but clear. And above them, watching from the trees, a third shape shadowed, indistinct but unmistakably human. Underneath, written in the same sharp hand from the journal, were the words, "I was never meant to be the witness." But the mountains chose otherwise. They found more journals, dozens, some dating back a decade or more. The story that began to emerge was fragmented but unmistakable. The occupant had once been part of a tight-knit group of wilderness survivalists, individuals who rejected society, not out of hatred, but out of a deep distrust in its promises. One journal spoke of the retreat, a movement that had dissolved after a tragic incident during a winter survival challenge. Another detailed the author's withdrawal from even that fringe community. Too soft, he had written. They still wanted to be found. He had not. Elise sat outside the bunker as the forensic team catalogued each item. She knew the story was nearly full now. But there were gaps. Deliberate ones. Whoever this man was, he hadn't vanished. Not truly. The place had been vacated recently. Dust was absent from the cot. A water bottle was still half full. A snare trap hung nearby. Freshly baited, he was still out there, and he knew someone was getting close. That night, Elise returned to the station. The bunker was locked down and tagged as a crime scene. But she couldn't stop thinking about the mural, about what it meant to choose silence, or to be chosen by it. She knew she would dream of cliffs again. Not of the fall, but of what watched from the trees. They brought in a profiler the following morning. Not because Elise asked for one, but because the case had shifted again. It was no longer a mystery about lost mountain bikers. It had become something colder, more deliberate. A story not of misadventure, but of surveillance. Prolonged, meticulous, silent observation. The profiler was a woman in her late 50s. Quiet, no small talk, hair pulled back in a gray twist that made her eyes seem even sharper. She stood in the shelter for nearly 20 minutes before saying anything at all. Just walked the perimeter slowly, hands behind her back, eyes scanning every detail: dust, shadow, nail placement, the grain of the wood. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet. This was someone who needed control more than companionship, she said. But not cruelty. He didn't hurt them. He watched. Why? Elise asked. The profiler just looked at her. Because he couldn't look away. The journals were combed through. They'd been stored in waterproof containers, some packed with desiccant to keep the pages dry. Dozens of notebooks, spiral-bound and cheap, but filled with tightly scripted lines of thought. Most of it was mundane food logs, weather patterns, and notations about animal migrations. But between the routine entries were the confessions. A pattern emerged. This man, whoever he was, had seen people go missing before. Hikers, campers, people who wandered too far from their trails. Some were found, others weren't. He never intervened. He called it the line. Once someone crossed into the true wilderness, they were no longer part of the world he had left behind. It wasn't his place to rescue them. But the boys had been different. They were laughing, he wrote in one entry, racing each other. They weren't looking at the trees, just the trail, like they believed the mountain owed them safe passage. There was no admission of guilt, no direct confession, but his entries described the day in detail. A broken line on the trail, a sound like thunder, then stillness. He found the wreckage later. Bikes shattered. One body immediately visible, the other lodged beneath the brush. Both are already still. And then he wrote something that chilled Elise more than anything else. I didn't go for help, because help wouldn't change what already was, and I couldn't carry them out, so I carried the memory instead. A forensic linguist was brought in to analyze the handwriting, the vocabulary, and the cadence of the notes. They were trying to build a profile from scratch. No name, no fingerprints, no record. But the journals gave them something better. Location, timelines, traces, years' worth of camp coordinates, weather logs, and even lists of foraged plants. The man had unknowingly mapped his own movements over a decade. Using those logs, Elise's team plotted out every known camp. There were over 30 scattered across the basin and beyond, each one active for a season or two before being abandoned. The man never stayed long in one place. He rotated in a pattern that made sense only in retrospect: a loop, spiraling slowly around the lake's perimeter, never closer than 5 miles to the nearest trailhead, always skirting the edge of civilization, but never touching it. And then came the break. One of the GPS points from 6 years earlier matched an old fire report Elise remembered from her early days on the force. A lightning strike had ignited a minor blaze deep in the forest. Barely an acre burned, no structures damaged. But the response had included a small ground crew, including a rookie firefighter, who had reported seeing a ghost of a man watching from a ridge. The description was vague: dirty clothes, beard, backpack slung low. But it placed the man in the area weeks before the boys went missing. It connected a presence to a place. They were getting closer. Meanwhile, the GoPro footage was being digitally enhanced. It was shaky, clipped, and corrupted in places by years of degradation. But a few frames were salvageable. In one of the final clips, just seconds before the camera disconnected, there was movement in the background. Not a person, a shape, blurry, tall, unmoving, watching. The camera had been mounted on one of the boys' helmets, which meant he had seen it, at least for a moment. The last thing he may have registered before the world fell out from under him wasn't the cliff, but the man standing silently in the trees beyond. Elise replayed the clip over and over again, not because she expected to see something new, but because she needed to feel the weight of what had been missed. The man had been right there, not minutes after, moments. The public still didn't know. The story was still officially developing. The families had been informed of the recent discoveries, the journals, the GoPro, and the indication that the fall may not have been witnessed by nature alone. But the implications were still being processed. No one wanted to announce to the world that their son's final moments had been observed by someone who had done nothing. But one of the fathers wanted to see the site, not for closure, for connection. He was quiet, like most men who carry long grief. His son's name was engraved on a pendant he wore under his shirt. He stood at the cliff's edge, hands in his pockets, eyes locked on the tree line across the basin. "They must have been so scared," he said. Elise didn't respond. There was no comfort to offer, only presence. As they turned to leave, the father paused and looked back once more. "You said he kept journals," he said. "Did he ever write about regret?" Elise hesitated, then nodded once. "Sometimes," she said, "but not enough." Back at the station, a new lead was forming. Someone had come forward. A former park contractor, now living in Oregon, who had recognized the shelter design from the news photos. He claimed to have sold plywood and materials to a man matching the vague profile: solitary, cash-paying, never giving a full name. The receipts were vague, but they added another link. A name, maybe the first one, maybe a lie. They had their first breadcrumb. The man may have vanished into the trees, but now the trees were giving him back. The name scribbled on the old receipt wasn't real. That much Elise knew the moment she read it aloud in the quiet hum of the evidence room. Tom Lake, not even trying to be clever. Just something generic enough to pass when signing for bulk nails and OSB sheets at a rural hardware store. But it was something. A placeholder in a puzzle that had survived 5 winters, 2 grieving families, and 1 terrible silence at the bottom of a cliff. The receipt came from a lumber supply yard on the outskirts of Kings Beach. Cash transaction. No vehicle plate. But the description offered by the store clerk, an older man with early-stage memory loss, was consistent with the growing profile. Tall, quiet, didn't make eye contact. Clothes didn't fit right. Like he hadn't been indoors in a long time. It fit. The profiler came back into the picture then, reviewing the journal entries again with a fresh perspective. She wasn't looking for intent now. She was looking for residue phrases that hinted at where he'd been before the woods. Patterns in word choice, linguistic tics. It was the language of someone who had once lived a very different life. The writing was deliberate, organized, structured like someone who'd trained their mind to be clinical, possibly military or engineering. He called the mountains parameters, the trees natural corridors, and wrote about weather like it was an equation. The image of a wild man, half mad and feral, fell apart. This was a man who had chosen isolation, not because he was broken, but because he was finished. Whatever he'd left behind had been intentional. Burned clean. The forest wasn't a punishment for him. It was peace, which made the act of observing the boys, of choosing not to help, all the more haunting. It wasn't madness. It was a calculation. A quiet, brutal math. In the town, word began to spread, not because of an official announcement, but because the forest has its own rumor mill. Rangers talk. Locals hear. Someone posted about the cliff guys on an outdoor subreddit, and suddenly, news crews were circling like ravens. Elise hated it, but there was no stopping it. The moment you uncover a truth long buried, people come running to sift the dirt for treasure. The families were shielded from the worst of it. For now. In the meantime, the team traced other Tom Lake purchases from the same year. One came from a second-hand gear shop in Truckee. Old camp stoves, water filters, and fire starter kits. No ID. Again. But the shop had a security camera. The footage had long since been overwritten, but the owner, a middle-aged woman with a sharp eye, remembered the buyer. Didn't say much. Paid in rolled-up bills. But his hands, they looked like bark. Like someone who hadn't held a pen in years. Piece by piece, a portrait emerged. A man in his late 40s or early 50s. Tall, wiry, lived off-grid for at least a decade. He rarely entered towns, and when he did, never twice in the same one. He built his shelters in patterns that suggested not randomness, but strategy close enough to observe, far enough to avoid detection. He was a ghost by design. And then came the final journal. It was tucked beneath the others in a smaller waterproof bag, harder to find. Bound with twine, the paper was stained with oil and soot. Different from the others, less organized. The handwriting slanted and sharp. More emotional, less filtered. The first line hit Elise like a punch to the ribs. I should have left the woods the day I heard them laugh. He went on to write about the sound, clear. Human joy echoing off the trees. He described the way it reached through his solitude like a blade. Not because he envied it, but because it woke something he'd spent years putting to sleep. He followed them that day. Not out of malice, he wrote, but because he wanted to remember what that sound was. Youth without fear. Movement without caution. They didn't know the danger they were in, not from him, but from the land. The trail they raced on curved sharply near a fault line in the cliff. He'd known about it, logged it, avoided it, but they didn't see it. He claimed he watched it happen. The earth gave way under one of them first, just a fraction of a second before the other veered too late to stop. He froze. Not out of cruelty, out of something older. Fear. Not of the boys, but of what it would mean to re-enter the world. To be responsible again. I wanted to help, but help meant returning, he wrote, and I had long since burned the bridges that led out. The final pages were quiet, reflective, almost ashamed. I thought burying their story would protect the silence, but now the silence tastes like rust. Elise folded the page and set the journal down. It was the closest thing to a confession they were going to get. A man who had spent 10 years disappearing had finally, painfully, written himself back into the world. The legal implications were limited. He hadn't caused the fall. He hadn't killed anyone. But he had watched. He had known. And he had chosen not to act. In the eyes of the law, it was negligence if he could be found. In the eyes of the families, it was betrayal. A betrayal of basic human decency. The last known location from the journals was dated 18 months prior. No one had seen or heard from him since. But Elise knew the woods never kept their ghosts forever. One day, someone would hear a footstep where there shouldn't be one. A flicker of movement in the trees. The distant sound of fire crackling in a stove no one built. And maybe then, finally, the watcher would be watched. The girl at the coroner's desk had been working there for only 3 months when the call came through. A backpacker, mid-30s, gaunt, eyes ringed with exhaustion, had found something unusual while hiking off-trail along a remote ridge, just east of Desolation Wilderness. He hadn't meant to be there, he told the dispatcher. Got turned around after losing the trail in a sudden weather front. He was sheltering under a rocky overhang when he saw a pile of rocks, too neatly arranged to be natural. A cairn. At the base of it, a small tin box, sealed with wax and electrical tape. He hadn't opened it. Something about it felt like it wasn't his to touch. When the forensic team arrived, they removed the tape carefully. Inside were laminated pages entries, not like the ones from the other journals. These were recent, still smelled faintly of smoke and pine resin. The ink hadn't yet faded. At the bottom of the tin was a single object, wrapped in cloth. A key, etched with the number 12, and a motel logo that no longer existed. They analyzed the handwriting. It matched the earlier entries. Same author, same rhythm, same fatal restraint. But the tone was different now. There was an edge to it, a fracture running beneath the words. "I think I died a long time ago," one entry read. "What you're reading is just the echo that stayed behind." In these final entries, he described seeing Elise from a distance, though he never used her name. Just the woman with the maps. He watched her from a ridge as she knelt at the base of the cliff where the boys had been found. He described the way she touched the stone and how she closed her eyes for a long moment. He said he felt something shift inside him then. Something he thought had been buried beneath 10 years of silence. Guilt, maybe. Or memory. Or the unbearable clarity that comes when you realize a story isn't yours to keep. The final page was a single sentence, written in trembling script. "I am done hiding." That was the last they ever heard from him. The key was traced. It belonged to a long-shuttered motor court near an old highway spur. The building had been condemned 5 years earlier, after a fire. They sent a team to investigate anyway, just in case. Room 12 was nothing but charred timbers and vines. Whatever it had once held was gone, consumed by weather and time. But for the families, there was a strange comfort in that. They didn't need an arrest. They didn't need a trial. They had answers now. Not complete ones, never complete, but enough to put shape to the silence. Enough to place a gravestone, not just a question mark. The funeral for the boys was held under the open sky, not far from the lake where they had spent that last morning. The sun cut through the clouds like a promise. Families came, friends, strangers who had followed the case from far away. Even some of the search volunteers who had stood in waist-deep snow 5 years ago. Elise stood at the back, out of uniform, her hands clenched around a photograph the parents had given her. It showed the boys at 15, standing next to their bikes, faces flushed with effort and joy. There was mud on their legs, scrapes on their arms, but they were laughing like the world had never ended and never would. She watched the ceremony unfold in silence, not because she had nothing to say, but because the story had already been told. Not by her, but by the trees, the wind, the journals, and the stones. Everything that mattered was written in the landscape now. When the last words were spoken and the people began to leave, Elise stayed behind. She walked to the edge of the field, where the grass gave way to brush, and sat with the photograph in her lap. She thought about the mountain, about the man in the woods who had chosen silence, and about the millions of small, human moments that could have gone another way. She didn't forgive him, not entirely, but she understood him in a way that felt sharp and unwelcome. Everyone carries a cliff inside them, she thought. Most just don't fall off. As the sky deepened into dusk, a small wind moved through the trees, rustling the leaves like a whisper. She closed her eyes and let it pass over her, brushing the hair from her face like an old friend. She stayed there for a long time, until the cold began to settle in her bones. When she stood and turned back toward the road, she didn't notice the figure, watching from the ridge, above, motionless, silent, barely distinguishable from the pines around him. But he saw her, and for the first time in a long time, he wept.